In the summer of 1941, as German forces swept across the Soviet frontier in the largest military operation in human history, small groups of young men from the Flemish-speaking regions of Belgium began presenting themselves at recruitment offices. They came from farms and factories, from universities and unemployment lines. Some wore the uniforms of pre-war nationalist movements. Others arrived in civilian clothes, carrying only the documents that proved their racial and political suitability. Within 4 years, the majority would be dead, captured, or scattered across a continent in ruins. This is the history of the Flemish Waffen-SS. To understand why Flemish men volunteered for service in the armed forces of Nazi Germany, one must first understand the political landscape of interwar Belgium. The country that emerged from the First World War was deeply fractured along linguistic, cultural, and economic lines. The Flemish-speaking population of the north had long chafed under what they perceived as francophone dominance in government, the military, and elite society. During the Great War, Flemish soldiers had died in trenches commanded by officers who often spoke only French, receiving orders they sometimes could not understand. The post-war period saw the emergence of organised political movements demanding greater autonomy, linguistic rights, and recognition for Flanders within the Belgian state. The Flemish movement, as this broad political tendency came to be known, was not monolithic. It encompassed moderate Democrats seeking cultural rights within the existing constitutional framework, Catholic conservatives defending traditional values against secular liberalism, and radical nationalists who dreamed of outright independence or union with the Netherlands. By the 1930s, the moderate centre was losing ground to more extreme voices. Economic depression, political instability, and the apparent success of authoritarian movements elsewhere in Europe convinced a growing number of Flemish activists that democracy had failed. The Flemish National League, known by its Dutch initials as the VNV, emerged as the dominant force in radical Flemish nationalism. Founded in 1933 under the leadership of Staff de Klerk, the VNV combined demands for Flemish autonomy with an authoritarian political programme inspired by Italian fascism and, increasingly, German National Socialism. The party built an extensive network of youth organisations, cultural associations and paramilitary formations. By the late 1930s, the VNV had established itself as a significant political force, winning seats in parliament and municipal councils across Flanders. Not all Flemish nationalists accepted the VNV's leadership. A smaller but more radical faction coalesced around the figure of Joris van Severen and his Verdinazo movement, which advocated for the creation of a Greater Netherlands incorporating Flanders, the Netherlands, and French Flanders. Van Severen's ideology blended nationalism with Catholic corporatism and a mystical attachment to the Burgundian past. His movement attracted intellectuals and romantics who found the VNV too pragmatic or too willing to work within the despised Belgian system. The German occupation of Belgium in May 1940 transformed the political landscape overnight. The Belgian government fled to London, the army surrendered after 18 days of fighting, and the country found itself under military administration. For radical Flemish nationalists, the German victory appeared to vindicate their belief that the old order was doomed. Some saw an opportunity to advance Flemish interests under German protection. Others genuinely believed that a German-dominated Europe would offer Flanders a better future than continued subjugation within Belgium. The German occupation authorities cultivated Flemish collaboration for their own reasons. The division of Belgium along linguistic lines served Nazi interests by weakening potential resistance and providing a pool of willing auxiliaries. German propaganda emphasized the supposed racial kinship between Flemish and Germanic peoples, flattering Flemish nationalists with the suggestion that they belonged to the Nordic master race rather than the despised Latin world of Wallonia and France. This racial appeal found receptive ears among those already inclined toward ethnic nationalism. Staff de Klerk and the VNV leadership chose the path of active collaboration. They believed that by proving their usefulness to Germany, they could secure Flemish autonomy and perhaps eventual union with the Reich as a Germanic partner state. But in the summer of 1940, with German power at its zenith and Allied prospects apparently hopeless, this outcome was not yet clear. The first Flemish volunteers for German military service appeared even before formal recruitment structures existed. Some crossed into Germany individually, presenting themselves at Wehrmacht offices or SS recruitment centres. Others joined the various auxiliary formations that the Germans established in occupied territories. The German authorities initially showed limited interest in Flemish volunteers. The Wehrmacht was forbidden from recruiting in occupied Western territories, and the SS leadership had not yet developed its later enthusiasm for foreign volunteers. The occupation authorities in Belgium pursued a careful policy of cultivating Flemish collaboration while maintaining ultimate control. German officials understood that Flemish nationalism could serve Reich interests, but they had no intention of creating genuinely autonomous Flemish institutions or military formations. Every concession to Flemish sentiment was calculated for its utility to German purposes. The volunteers who would eventually serve in German uniform would do so entirely on German terms. The administrative framework for Flemish collaboration developed gradually during 1940 and 1941. German agencies established contacts with VNV leadership and other nationalist organisations exploring the potential for cooperation in various spheres. Economic collaboration came first, with Flemish businesses integrated into the German war economy. Cultural collaboration followed, with German support for Flemish language and identity serving to deepen the divisions within Belgian society. Military collaboration would prove the ultimate expression of this relationship. This changed following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was presented not merely as a war of conquest, but as an ideological crusade against Bolshevism, a struggle in which all Europeans had a stake. The SS leadership saw an opportunity to expand its forces while simultaneously demonstrating the appeal of National Socialist ideology beyond Germany's borders. Heinrich Himmler authorized the creation of volunteer formations from Germanic peoples, including Flemish, Dutch, and Scandinavian recruits. The recruitment of Flemish volunteers proceeded through a collaboration between German SS authorities and Flemish nationalist organizations. The VNV leadership endorsed military service on the Eastern Front as a demonstration of Flemish commitment to the anti-Bolshevik cause. Recruitment propaganda emphasized the threat that Soviet communism posed to European civilization, religion, and traditional values. Young men were told that they would be defending their homeland by fighting in Russia, that a German victory would guarantee Flemish freedom, and that military service would earn Flanders a place of honour in the new European order. The first Flemish volunteers were initially grouped with Dutch recruits in a formation designated SS Standarte Noordwest, established in the summer of 1941. This unit was based at the SS training facility at Hamburg-Langenhorn, where volunteers underwent basic military instruction under German NCOs and officers. The training was harsh by any standard, designed to instill discipline and obedience while weeding out those deemed physically or psychologically unsuitable. Flemish and Dutch volunteers trained side by side, though tensions between the two groups emerged almost immediately. The Germans subjected potential volunteers to racial and political screening before acceptance. Applicants had to demonstrate Aryan ancestry, pass medical examinations, and show evidence of political reliability. Those with criminal records, known leftist sympathies, or racially questionable backgrounds were rejected. The screening process was not always rigorous in practice, particularly as the war continued and manpower demands increased, but it established the principle that service in the SS was a privilege reserved for the racially and ideologically worthy. By the autumn of 1941, it became clear that the mixed Dutch-Flemish arrangement was unsatisfactory. Linguistic differences, national rivalries, and divergent political traditions created friction within the unit. The German authorities decided to separate the Flemish volunteers into their own formation. In September 1941, the Flemish contingent was redesignated as the Freiwilligen Legion Vlaanderen, or Volunteer Legion Flanders. This was not yet a full Waffen-SS unit, but rather an auxiliary formation attached to the SS with a nominal strength of approximately 1,000 men organised as an infantry battalion. The Legion Flanders received its commanding officer in the person of SS Sturmbannführer Michael Lippert, a German SS veteran who had participated in the liquidation of the SA leadership during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Lippert brought experience and ruthlessness to his command, though he had little understanding of Flemish culture or politics. The German officer corps that staffed the Legion's senior positions shared this characteristic. They viewed their Flemish subordinates as useful auxiliaries, but never as equals. an attitude that would persist throughout the war. Training continued through the autumn and winter of 1941 to 1942. The Flemish legionaries learned infantry tactics, weapons handling, and the brutal discipline that characterized SS formations. Those who proved unable to meet standards were dismissed and returned to Belgium. Those who completed training received the distinctive SS runes and the cuff title identifying their unit. They had become, at least formally, members of the armed SS, bound by oath to Adolf Hitler, and committed to the ideological war against Bolshevism. The equipment issued to the Legion Flanders reflected its status as a foreign auxiliary formation. The volunteers received standard German infantry weapons, including the Karabiner 98K rifle, the MP-40 submachine gun, and the MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns. Heavy weapons were limited, with the Legion initially lacking significant artillery or armoured support. The men wore standard SS field uniforms with the distinctive cuff title and collar insignia identifying their unit. Winter equipment would prove inadequate for the conditions they would encounter. The administrative organisation of the Legion followed standard German military patterns adapted for a foreign formation. The battalion structure included rifle companies, a heavy weapons company, and supporting elements. German officers held the senior command positions, with German NCOs providing training and tactical leadership at the small unit level. Flemish volunteers might serve as squad leaders or in other junior positions, but they remained subordinate to German authority at every significant decision point. The Legion Flanders departed for the Eastern Front in November 1941, travelling by rail through Germany and Poland to the northern sector of the front. The journey itself was a revelation for many volunteers. They passed through landscapes devastated by the summer fighting, saw the endless columns of Soviet prisoners being marched westward, and witnessed firsthand the scale of the war they had joined. The romanticism of the recruiting posters gave way to the industrial reality of mechanized warfare. The volunteers had been told they would fight in a swift campaign against a crumbling enemy. Instead, they arrived as the German offensive ground to a halt in the winter snows outside Moscow. The war they had imagined, one of rapid advances and easy victories, did not exist. The war they entered was one of frozen trenches, partisan attacks, and grinding attrition. The initial enthusiasm that had accompanied departure from Belgium faded quickly in the face of Eastern Front reality. The Legion was attached to Army Group North, operating in the region between Lake Ilmen and the Volkhov River. This sector of the front had seen heavy fighting since the summer, as German forces attempted to complete the encirclement of Leningrad, while Soviet counterattacks sought to relieve the besieged city. The terrain was a nightmare of forests, swamps, and scattered villages, rendered nearly impassable by the winter conditions. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Men froze in their positions. Equipment failed. Supply lines stretched to breaking point. The Flemish legionaries experienced their first combat in December 1941 and January 1942, conducting defensive operations against Soviet probing attacks. The casualties began almost immediately. Men who had trained in the relative comfort of German barracks found themselves dying in snowdrifts thousands of kilometers from home. The gap between propaganda expectations and battlefield reality was stark and immediate. Some volunteers adapted to the conditions and proved capable soldiers. Others broke under the strain, suffering physical collapse or psychological breakdown. German attitudes toward the Flemish legionaries were mixed. Some German officers and NCOs developed respect for individual Flemish soldiers who demonstrated courage and competence under fire. Others dismissed the entire formation as unreliable auxiliaries, fit only for secondary duties. The Legion was never given independent command responsibility or trusted with critical defensive positions. It remained subordinate to German headquarters at every level, its deployment determined by German operational needs rather than any consideration of Flemish interests or capabilities. The spring of 1942 brought a temporary reduction in combat intensity as both sides prepared for summer offensives. The Legion Flanders used this period to absorb replacements, train new arrivals, and recover from the winter fighting. Casualties had been significant, though precise figures from this period are difficult to establish. The Legion's combat strength had declined considerably from its original deployment numbers, a pattern that would continue throughout its existence. Throughout 1942, the Legion participated in defensive operations in the Volkhov sector. The fighting was characterized by limited objectives, local attacks and counterattacks, and the constant attrition of trench warfare. Soviet forces maintained pressure on the German lines, seeking weak points and opportunities for local penetrations. The Flemish legionaries spent months in forward positions, enduring artillery bombardment, sniper fire, and the grinding psychological strain of static warfare. The romantic vision of crusading knights defending European civilization against Bolshevik hordes gave way to the grim reality of survival in a frozen hell. The Volkhov sector had particular strategic significance in 1942. Soviet forces attempted to relieve Leningrad through offensives across the Volkhov River, leading to some of the war's most brutal fighting. The Second Shock Army's offensive in January 1942 achieved initial success before becoming encircled in the swamps and forests east of the river. German forces, including the Legion Flanders, participated in the reduction of this pocket over subsequent months. The fighting was close quarters and merciless, with neither side showing quarter in the forested terrain. The conditions in the Volkhov sector tested the limits of human endurance. The terrain was a maze of swamps, forests, and scattered settlements connected by primitive roads that became impassable during the spring thaw and autumn rains. Mosquitoes plagued troops during summer months, while winter brought temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Medical evacuation was difficult, and wounded men often died before reaching aid stations. Disease claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy action. The Legion's combat performance during this period appears to have been adequate, if not exceptional. German reports noted both instances of steady defence and occasions when Flemish units required support from German reserves. The volunteers were learning the brutal trade of infantry warfare, but they were doing so at considerable cost. Each month brought new casualties, new replacements, and the gradual loss of the original volunteers who had departed Belgium filled with ideological certainty. The unit's character changed as combat veterans replaced enthusiastic novices. Back in occupied Belgium, the recruitment of additional volunteers continued. The VNV and affiliated organisations maintained propaganda campaigns emphasising the noble purpose of the Eastern Front crusade. New recruits were promised adventure, comradeship and service to the Flemish cause. They were not told about frozen corpses, inadequate supplies, or the contempt with which German officers sometimes regarded their Flemish subordinates. Recruitment numbers fluctuated with the fortunes of war, increasing after German victories and declining following setbacks. The year 1943 brought significant changes to the Flemish SS formations. The German authorities, facing mounting manpower shortages and seeking to maximise the utilisation of foreign volunteers, decided to upgrade the Legion Flanders to brigade status. In June 1943, the formation was redesignated as the SS Freiwilligen Sturmbrigade Langemark, named for the Belgian town where German student volunteers had allegedly attacked French positions while singing patriotic songs in November 1914. The Langemark myth held powerful symbolic resonance in German nationalist memory, and the name was intended to link Flemish service to this supposed tradition of Germanic sacrifice. The elevation to brigade status did not substantially change the formation's combat capabilities. On paper, a brigade should have numbered several thousand men with supporting weapons and organic artillery. In practice, the Sturmbrigade Langemark never approached its authorised strength. The corps remained the survivors of the original Legion, supplemented by new Belgian recruits, transfers from other units, and a growing number of ethnic Germans and Volksdeutsche who filled positions that could not be staffed by genuine Flemish volunteers. The brigade's command structure remained firmly in German hands. SS Sturmbannführer Konrad Schellong assumed command, bringing experience from previous postings, but inheriting the same structural problems that had plagued the Legion. German officers held all senior positions. German was the language of command. Flemish volunteers might earn tactical leadership roles at the platoon or company level, but strategic decisions remained exclusively German prerogatives. The officer corps of the Sturmbrigade Langemark reflected the hybrid nature of the formation. German SS officers provided professional military leadership, bringing combat experience and institutional knowledge that the Flemish volunteers lacked. Below them, a small cadre of Flemish officers had emerged through the ranks, men who had proven themselves in combat and demonstrated the leadership qualities that earned German respect. These Flemish officers served as intermediaries between the German command and the rank and file, translating orders and maintaining unit cohesion. The NCO structure was similarly mixed. German Unterführer provided the backbone of small unit leadership, drawing on the traditions and training methods of the regular SS Flemish NCOs, promoted from the ranks of effective soldiers, supplemented this cadre as the war continued and experienced personnel became increasingly scarce. The quality of NCO leadership varied considerably, with some units maintaining effective discipline, while others suffered from the departure of experienced leaders, killed or wounded in combat. Throughout 1943, the Sturmbrigade Langemark continued operations in the northern sector of the Eastern Front. The strategic situation was deteriorating steadily following the German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. Army Group North found itself increasingly on the defensive, conducting fighting withdrawals and attempting to maintain coherent front lines against Soviet offensives that grew stronger with each passing month. The Flemish Brigade participated in these defensive operations, holding assigned sectors, conducting local counterattacks, and absorbing the constant casualties that such fighting entailed. The brigade's deployment during this period included operations against Soviet partisan formations as well as frontline combat. The vast forests and swamps behind German lines sheltered partisan groups that attacked supply lines, ambushed isolated units, and gathered intelligence for Soviet forces. Anti-partisan operations were brutal by their nature, involving sweeps through villages suspected of harbouring guerrillas, collective punishment of civilian populations, and reprisals for partisan attacks. The historical record regarding Flemish participation in such operations is incomplete, though the brigade's presence in rear areas during certain periods is documented. The winter of 1943 to 1944 saw continued fighting in the Leningrad sector. Soviet forces launched a major offensive in January 1944 that finally lifted the siege of Leningrad and drove German forces westward. The Sturmbrigade Langemark participated in the subsequent defensive battles and retreats, suffering significant casualties as Army Group North attempted to maintain a coherent front. The fighting withdrawal through the Baltic states would continue for months, with the brigade repeatedly committed to defensive actions against pursuing Soviet forces. Among the Flemish volunteers who served during this period, several individuals would later receive recognition through German military decorations, including the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. The first Flemish recipient was SS Untersturmführer Remy Schreinen, who received the award on 21 September 1944 for actions during defensive fighting on the Eastern Front. Schreinen had demonstrated exceptional leadership during combat in the Narva sector, where German and foreign SS formations conducted a prolonged defence against Soviet attempts to break through into Estonia. Remy Schreinen was born in 1921 in the Flemish town of Neeritieren. He had volunteered for the Legion Flanders in its early days, motivated by a combination of anti-communist conviction and Flemish nationalist sentiment. He proved an effective combat leader, rising through the ranks to officer status and earning German respect for his performance under fire. His Knight's Cross reflected genuine battlefield achievement, whatever judgment history might render on the cause he served. He would survive the war and return to Belgium, where he faced legal consequences for his service. Schreinen remains the sole Flemish volunteer to have received the Knight's Cross during the war. Other Flemish soldiers received lesser decorations for combat performance, including the Iron Cross in its various classes, but none achieved the level of recognition accorded to Schreinen. This fact reflects both the relatively modest scale of Flemish participation and the German tendency to reserve their highest honours for personnel from formations they considered more reliable or significant. The Flemish units produced capable individual soldiers, but they were never granted the institutional recognition that might have led to additional Knight's Cross recommendations. The Narva battles of early 1944 represented a significant chapter in the history of foreign SS formations on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces sought to breach German defences along the Narva River and advance into Estonia, while an improvised German defensive force that included multiple foreign volunteer units conducted a determined resistance. The fighting was intense and costly for both sides. The Sturmbrigade Langemark, along with Dutch, Estonian and other foreign formations, participated in this defensive stand, which succeeded in delaying the Soviet advance for several months. The defensive position at Narva rested on the natural obstacle of the river itself and the fortified bridgehead on its eastern bank. German forces held a series of positions along the river and on the elevated ground to the west, including the critical high points known as the Blue Hills. Soviet attacks came in waves throughout the spring of 1944, each attempting to break through the defensive line and open the road into Estonia and beyond. The defenders held, though at enormous cost in casualties that could not be adequately replaced. The Flemish Brigade occupied positions in the Narva sector during some of the heaviest fighting. The men dug in along defensive lines that had been prepared over preceding months, manning trenches, bunkers, and strongpoints that would become their homes for weeks at a time. Soviet artillery maintained constant pressure, supplemented by air attacks when weather permitted. Infantry assaults came repeatedly, sometimes achieving local penetrations that had to be eliminated through immediate counterattack. The fighting demanded everything the defenders could give. German propaganda made much of the Narva fighting, presenting it as evidence that European volunteers were willing to sacrifice their lives in defense of Western civilization against Bolshevism. The reality was more complex, though. The foreign volunteers who fought at Narva did so under German command, for German operational objectives in a war that Germany was clearly losing. Their bravery was real, but it served a cause that offered no realistic prospect of the outcomes they had been promised. The defensive success at Narva merely delayed an outcome that had become inevitable. By mid-1944, the German authorities decided to upgrade the Sturmbrigade Langemarck to divisional status. In September 1944, the formation was redesignated as the 27th SS Freiwilligen Grenadier Division Langemarck. This apparent promotion was entirely administrative fiction. The division never possessed anything approaching its authorized strength of personnel or equipment. It never exceeded brigade strength in practice, and at times fell below even that modest level. The designation served German propaganda purposes and organizational convenience, rather than reflecting any genuine increase in combat capability. The paper designation of division concealed a progressive decline in actual capability. The original volunteers who had joined the Legion Flanders with ideological conviction had largely been killed, wounded, or captured. Their replacements included conscripts, ethnic Germans with no connection to Flanders, and men whose motivations ranged from genuine belief to economic desperation to simple survival. Unit cohesion, built on shared ideology and common origin, eroded as the formation became increasingly heterogeneous. The command of the division passed through several hands during its brief existence. German officers continued to dominate senior positions, though some Flemish officers had by this point acquired sufficient experience for regimental and battalion commands. The division's operational readiness was compromised by shortages of everything from ammunition to winter clothing. Training for new arrivals was abbreviated or non-existent. The German military machine was consuming resources faster than they could be replaced, and foreign volunteer formations ranked low on any priority list. The autumn of 1944 brought catastrophe across all fronts. In the west, Allied forces had liberated France and Belgium, reaching the borders of Germany itself. Brussels was liberated in early September, and with it the VNV leadership and other collaborators fled eastward into Germany. The political foundation of Flemish collaboration collapsed along with the occupation regime. In the east, Soviet forces drove through the Baltic states and into Poland, destroying German armies and advancing inexorably toward the Reich. For Flemish volunteers still serving on the Eastern Front, the liberation of Belgium transformed their situation fundamentally. They could no longer pretend that they were serving Flemish interests or defending their homeland against distant Bolshevism. They had become stateless men fighting for a losing cause, unable to return home and unlikely to survive a Soviet victory. Some deserted. Others clung to the desperate hope that Germany might yet achieve some favourable outcome. Most simply continued because they saw no alternative. The 27th SS Freiwilligen Grenadier Division Langemarck spent the final months of 1944 in defensive operations in the northern sector of the Eastern Front. The division was repeatedly committed to blocking positions, attempting to delay Soviet advances, while German forces conducted fighting withdrawals. Casualties were severe. Replacements were inadequate. The division's combat strength declined steadily, as losses exceeded reinforcements. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the Soviet offensive that would end the war in Europe. Red Army forces launched massive attacks across the entire Eastern Front, breaking through German defensive lines and advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. The carefully constructed defenses that had held for months collapsed under the weight of Soviet numerical superiority and overwhelming firepower. German forces retreated westward in increasing disorder, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion, and suffering catastrophic casualties. The Vistula-Oder offensive, launched on the 12th of January 1945, represented the death blow to German resistance in the east. Soviet forces achieved breakthroughs across multiple sectors, encircling and destroying German formations that attempted to hold their positions. The offensive advanced with a speed that exceeded even Soviet expectations, covering distances that would have taken months in earlier years. By early February, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River within striking distance of Berlin itself. The remnants of the Langemarck Division participated in this final catastrophe. The formation was committed to defensive positions in Pomerania, attempting to hold a shrinking perimeter around the Baltic coast. Soviet forces pushed steadily forward, encircling isolated German formations and destroying those that attempted to stand. The division lost what remained of its heavy equipment. Its units became scattered and intermixed with the fragments of other destroyed formations. Effective command and control broke down as the front disintegrated. The Pomeranian campaign of February and March 1945 saw the final destruction of coherent German resistance in the region. Soviet forces drove north toward the Baltic, cutting off German formations and eliminating them piecemeal. The civilian population fled westward in desperate columns, joining the military retreat in a chaos of refugees, wounded soldiers, and scattered units seeking escape. The Flemish survivors found themselves caught in this maelstrom, their formation existing only as scattered groups of men trying to survive. By March 1945, the Langemarck Division existed primarily on paper. Its surviving personnel had been consolidated into improvised battle groups, fighting alongside Germans, other foreign volunteers, and the desperate conscripts of the final levies. Some Flemish soldiers remained committed to resistance, whether from ideological conviction, fear of capture, or simple inertia. Others sought opportunities to surrender to Western forces, hoping that American or British captivity would prove more survivable than Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. The final weeks of the war saw the complete dissolution of organised Flemish formations. Small groups of survivors made their way westward through the chaos of collapsing Germany, hoping to reach American or British lines before being overtaken by Soviet forces. Some succeeded, others were captured by the Red Army and faced years of captivity in Soviet camps, from which many would never return. The fortunate few who reached Western lines often found themselves detained as suspected war criminals or collaborators. The end of the war brought a comprehensive reckoning for those who had served in the Flemish SS. Belgium's post-liberation government pursued an aggressive policy of collaboration trials, prosecuting those who had aided the German occupation. Military service in German formations was treated as treason, carrying severe penalties including death for those convicted of the most serious charges. The returning volunteers faced arrest, trial and imprisonment. The scale of Belgian collaboration trials was substantial. Thousands of individuals faced prosecution for various forms of collaboration, from administrative cooperation with occupation authorities to active military service in German formations. Those who had served in the Waffen-SS faced the most serious charges, as their voluntary enlistment in the armed forces of the enemy constituted clear-cut treason under Belgian law. The courts showed little mercy for ideological motivation or claims of youthful naivety. The Belgian military justice system processed cases according to established categories of collaboration. Economic collaboration, administrative collaboration, and military collaboration each carried different potential penalties. Military service in German formations fell into the most serious category, particularly when combined with evidence of voluntary enlistment, ideological motivation, or participation in specific operations. The prosecutors built cases from captured German records, witness testimony, and the defendants' own statements. The trials proceeded through 1945, 1946, and into subsequent years as the full scope of collaboration became clear. Defendants appeared before military tribunals, their cases heard by judges who had often experienced the occupation firsthand. Defense arguments varied, with some defendants claiming coercion, others citing youthful ignorance, and a few maintaining their ideological convictions even in the courtroom. The outcomes depended on individual circumstances, the specific evidence available, and the temperament of the presiding judges. Sentences varied according to individual circumstances. Some former SS volunteers received death sentences, though most of these were commuted to lengthy prison terms. Others received sentences ranging from several years to life imprisonment. The severity of punishment often depended on specific actions during service, with those implicated in atrocities or war crimes facing the harshest treatment. Even those who escaped the most serious charges typically spent years in prison before conditional release. The execution of death sentences occurred in the immediate post-war period, with those convicted of the most serious charges facing firing squads. The numbers executed for military collaboration were significant, though precise figures remain debated by historians. Those whose sentences were commuted faced long years of imprisonment, often in harsh conditions that reflected the general attitude toward collaborators. Rehabilitation and release came gradually, with most surviving prisoners freed by the mid-1950s under various amnesty provisions. The treatment of Flemish SS veterans in the immediate post-war period was harsh by any measure. They were viewed not merely as criminals, but as traitors who had betrayed their country during its darkest hour. Public opinion showed little sympathy for their circumstances or motivations. The liberation atmosphere demanded punishment for those who had collaborated, and the SS volunteers represented collaboration in its most extreme form. Families of collaborators faced social ostracism that extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Those who survived Soviet captivity faced a different ordeal. Soviet prisoner of war camps were notorious for their brutal conditions, inadequate food, forced labour, and high mortality rates. German SS personnel were treated particularly harshly, and foreign volunteers who had served in SS formations received no better treatment. Many Flemish volunteers captured by Soviet forces died in captivity. Those who survived often spent years in labour camps before eventual repatriation. The long-term memory of the Flemish SS in post-war Belgium remained contentious for decades. For most Belgians, the volunteers represented a shameful episode best forgotten, evidence of how collaboration and extremism had led some of their countrymen to fight for the enemy. For a small minority, particularly within certain Flemish nationalist circles, the volunteers were remembered as misguided idealists who had sacrificed themselves for a cause they believed in, however wrongly. The historical assessment of the Flemish Waffen-SS must avoid both the glorification of Nazi propaganda and the simplistic condemnation that serves contemporary political purposes. The volunteers were real people who made real choices in specific historical circumstances. They were shaped by the political culture of interwar Flanders, by the apparent success of German arms in 1940 and 1941, and by ideological convictions that seemed more plausible then than they do in retrospect. Understanding their motivations does not require endorsing their choices. The military performance of Flemish SS formations was neither exceptional nor disgraceful. They fought competently in defensive operations, suffered heavily in the attritional warfare of the Eastern Front, and disintegrated along with the German military machine in the final catastrophe. They were never granted the autonomy or recognition that collaboration had promised. They served German interests without advancing Flemish ones. They died in their thousands for outcomes they neither desired nor expected. The estimated total of Flemish volunteers who served in various German formations during the war is approximately 8,000 to 9,000 individuals, depending on whether auxiliary formations and late war conscripts are included. Of these, a substantial majority died in combat or captivity, with survival rates likely falling below 50%. The survivors returned to a homeland that largely rejected them, facing legal consequences and social stigma that followed them for the rest of their lives. The political organisations that had promoted collaboration did not survive the war. The VNV was dissolved, its leaders dead, imprisoned, or exiled. Staff de Klerk had died during the occupation, spared the reckoning that awaited his followers. Other prominent collaborators faced trial and punishment. The dream of Flemish autonomy under German protection had been exposed as a catastrophic miscalculation, bought at the price of thousands of lives and decades of shame. The historiography of the Flemish SS has evolved considerably since 1945. Early accounts were shaped by the immediate post-war context, either condemning collaboration in absolute terms or, in rare cases, attempting rehabilitation of the volunteers' reputation. More recent scholarship has sought to understand the phenomenon in its historical context, examining the specific factors that led Flemish men to volunteer while avoiding anachronistic judgment. The archives of multiple nations have gradually become accessible, allowing more precise reconstruction of events, organisations, and individual fates. The story of the Flemish Waffen-SS is ultimately a story of miscalculation, disillusionment, and destruction. Young men who believed they were serving their homeland found themselves fighting and dying in a foreign war for objectives that had nothing to do with Flanders. The German regime that accepted their service regarded them as expendable auxiliaries, useful for absorbing casualties but never worthy of genuine partnership. The Flemish nationalist movement that endorsed collaboration destroyed itself in the process, achieving none of its goals while bearing the stain of association with Nazi Germany. The individual tragedies within this larger catastrophe are beyond counting. Men who might have lived productive lives instead died in frozen trenches or Soviet prison camps. Families were torn apart by the consequences of collaboration. Communities that had known these men as neighbours, classmates, or relatives had to reconcile their memories with the reality of what had occurred. The social wounds inflicted by collaboration and its punishment took generations to heal, and some would argue that complete healing remains elusive. For the historian, the Flemish SS represents a case study in the dynamics of collaboration, ideological motivation, and military service. The volunteers did not join because they were uniquely evil or uniquely noble. They joined because specific historical circumstances made such service appear rational, even admirable, to those who accepted certain premises about politics, race, and European civilization. When those premises proved false, when the promised outcomes failed to materialize, the volunteers found themselves trapped in a catastrophe from which there was no honorable exit. The military record of the formations themselves, stripped of political context, shows competent, if not exceptional, infantry units that performed adequately under difficult circumstances. The Legion Flanders, the Sturmbrigade Langemarck, and the 27th SS Freiwilligen Grenadier Division were never elite formations comparable to the premier German SS divisions. They were foreign auxiliaries who filled a role in the German order of battle, absorbing their share of casualties and contributing their share of combat power to a losing cause. The recognition accorded to individual Flemish soldiers through German decorations reflected genuine battlefield performance. The Knight's Cross recipients earned their awards through documented acts of courage and leadership. That their courage served a criminal regime does not make it less real. The historian's task is to understand, not to praise or condemn. The men who earned these decorations demonstrated certain military virtues even as their service contributed to objectives that history has rightly rejected. The post-war fate of the surviving volunteers illustrates the comprehensive nature of the defeat they suffered. They lost the war, lost their cause, and lost their place in their homeland society. Those who escaped death or lengthy imprisonment still bore the stigma of their service for the rest of their lives. The communities that had produced them largely chose to forget rather than understand. The political movement that had led them into collaboration was erased from Belgian politics, its brief prominence followed by decades of marginalisation. The legacy of the Flemish SS cannot be separated from the larger legacy of the Second World War in Belgium and Europe. Collaboration was not a Flemish phenomenon alone. It occurred in every occupied country, taking form specific to each national context. The Flemish case was distinguished by its scale, its ideological intensity, and its connection to pre-existing nationalist movements, but it was not unique. Understanding why men volunteered for German service requires understanding the political culture, the historical moment, and the human capacity for self-deception that collaboration exploited. The final accounting of the Flemish SS must include the recognition that these men, whatever their motivations, served a regime responsible for unprecedented crimes. The Waffen-SS, for all its pretensions to being a purely military organisation, was an integral part of the Nazi apparatus of repression and extermination. Service in SS formations, even formations that were not directly involved in atrocities, contributed to a system that murdered millions. This historical context cannot be wished away or relativized through focus on individual acts of battlefield courage. At the same time, historical understanding requires more than moral condemnation. The men who served in the Flemish SS were products of specific circumstances, shaped by forces they did not fully understand, and motivated by goals they were never given the opportunity to achieve. Their story is tragic in the classical sense, a tale of humans caught in larger forces that ultimately destroyed them. The tragedy does not excuse their choices, but it makes those choices comprehensible in ways that simple vilification does not. The formations themselves have passed into history, their organisation tables and unit designations preserved only in archives and specialist studies. No monuments commemorate their service, no veterans organisations celebrate their memory. They belong to the defeated, the discredited, and the forgotten. Yet their story retains historical significance precisely because it illuminates the circumstances under which ordinary people make extraordinary choices, choosing paths that lead to destruction, rather than the salvation they imagined. The final survivors of the Flemish Waffen-SS have passed from the scene. The generation that made these choices and bore their consequences is gone. What remains is the documentary record, the archival evidence, and the historian's responsibility to reconstruct and explain without falsification or excuse. The story of the Flemish SS, like the larger story of the Second World War, belongs to history now. It is no longer living memory, but historical evidence, to be examined, understood, and preserved for those who would learn from it. This documentary has traced the arc of the Flemish Waffen-SS from its origins in interwar nationalism through its formation, deployment, combat service, and ultimate destruction. It has examined the political circumstances that made collaboration appear viable, the military realities that consumed thousands of lives, and the post-war consequences that followed defeat. Throughout, it has sought to maintain the historian's essential commitment to accuracy, context, and the avoidance of anachronistic judgment. The men who served in the Flemish SS were neither heroes nor monsters. They were historical actors who made choices within specific circumstances, choices that led to outcomes they neither anticipated nor desired. Their story offers no simple lessons, no comfortable morals, no vindication of any contemporary position. It offers only the complex, ambiguous, tragic truth of human beings caught in history's worst catastrophe, contributing to its horrors while becoming its victims. The Flemish Waffen-SS began with recruitment offices and ideological conviction. It ended in frozen battlefields, prison camps, and courtrooms. Between beginning and end lay years of combat, thousands of casualties, and the progressive dissolution of every hope that had motivated service. The volunteers who presented themselves in 1941 could not have imagined where their choices would lead. By 1945, those who survived understood all too well. The gap between expectation and outcome defines their tragedy and constitutes their historical significance. The archives preserve their names, their service records, their decorations, and their fates. The historical record, incomplete though it is, allows reconstruction of their experiences and understanding of their motivations. Future generations may study them as examples of how political conviction can lead to catastrophic choices, how ideological certainty can blind people to obvious dangers, and how the desire to serve a cause can lead to complicity in its crimes. And these are not pleasant lessons, but they are necessary ones. The story ends here, with the dissolution of the formations, the imprisonment of the survivors, and the passage of living memory into historical record. What the Flemish SS meant, what lessons it offers, what significance it holds for the present, these are questions that exceed the historian's mandate. So the task has been to tell the story as it happened, to document the choices and their consequences, to preserve the record for those who would understand. That task is now complete. The Flemish Waffen-SS existed for less than 4 years. In that time, it consumed the lives of thousands of young men who believed they were serving a worthy cause. It achieved nothing that its members had been promised. It left behind widows, orphans, and families scarred by loss and shame. It contributed to a war machine that brought unprecedented destruction to Europe and the world. And then it vanished into history, leaving only documents, memories, and the enduring obligation to understand what happened and why.